During World War II, the American Army Air Force flew 3 primary heavy bombers: the B-17, the B-29, and the Consolidated Aircraft Corporation B-24 Liberator. It was not the most beautiful or even popular plane of the war, but in many ways it was the most effective. Some 18,000 of them were built between 1940 and 1945. They had a nearly 3,000-mile range and could carry 8,000 pounds of bombs. They would see action in virtually every theater. They would be crucial in winning the war against the U-boat. In the spring of 1940, German panzers smashed into the Low Countries. France and the Low Countries were overrun. Britain was threatened. The Allies desperately needed a heavy bomber that could fly long distances. The Liberator seemed the perfect answer. First flown at the beginning of 1940, France ordered 175 aircraft. The French would be overrun before delivery, and the Royal Air Force took the planes instead. They coined the name Liberator, and the designation stuck. Men and women in American aircraft factories worked overtime to produce the planes. The great arsenal of democracy was going to save Britain. The RAF was impressed by the long range of the aircraft, as well as its performance. As the first planes rolled off the production line, they headed for the UK. Ironically, a number of these early aircraft didn't go into combat, but were used to ferry men across the Atlantic, as the Liberator was the only large transport with the range to make the hop without refueling. 3 planes went to BOAC, the British passenger company, to be used as transports. The B-24 carried a crew of 10 and had a maximum speed of 300 miles per hour. It could fly as high as 32,500 feet, although it was not pressurized. Initially, its weapons included a nose gun, top and bottom turrets, and waist guns, as well as a rear gun. This heavy armament would serve it well in fighting off enemy fighters. Its relatively large bomb bay made it ideal for conversion to transport. Indeed, Winston Churchill used a Liberator as his personal transport aircraft. Ultimately, the Liberators made for fighting made their way into American and British combat units. They were first used on anti-submarine patrols, having been rigged to carry depth charges. These Liberators also had airborne radar systems to search for ships and were armed with 20mm cannon. The Liberator didn't have to hit a submarine directly. Just the pressure of a nearby depth charge exploding could crush a U-boat's hull. Still, if a sub surfaced, the Liberator's considerable armament gave it a fighting chance in any skirmish. At its core, of course, the Liberator was a heavy, high-altitude bomber. The B-24D model was the version first made in large numbers for the U.S. Army Air Force. Design changes and modifications had brought the gross weight of the B-24 to 60,000 pounds. This was becoming a very heavy bomber. The internal bomb load was now 8,800 pounds. Some models were modified to carry an extra 1-ton bomb externally. The bomb bay was large enough for the bombs to hang vertically in the bomb bay doors, rolled up inside the fuselage, keeping the Liberator more aerodynamically trimmed during bomb runs. This feature unfortunately weakened the belly of the plane, so in the event of a B-24 ditching, crewmen would quickly have to move reinforcing struts into the bomb bay to keep it from crushing upon impact. Traditionally, in Europe, the bombers flew in tight box formations. The idea was, since the bombers couldn't outfly the German fighters, the concentration of firepower from within the box would at least keep them at bay. The idea worked to an extent. Still, flying on raids was dangerous duty. The B-24 was, in many ways, best suited for action in the Pacific. Ironically, it was a B-24 that was the first American casualty in the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Soon the bomber was on the offensive and went into action against the Japanese in January 1942. Its long range made it perfect for operations where the distances between island airfields was great. The nose art of the B-24 Liberators in the Pacific were just as graphic as those of any in the Allied Air Forces. The men were far from home, and there were few diversions available to them to remind them of things more pleasant than flying bombing runs. The artwork not only made the planes more individualistic, they also served as lucky charms, anything that would help increase the odds of coming home alive and in one piece. Some nose art reflected the serious side of war, the tallies of kills against enemy positions, ships, and planes. The B-24s assigned to the Pacific were lighter in weight than those assigned to Europe. This gave the planes the additional range they would need to fly over the long stretches of water. Because the Liberator was used in so many different roles, problems developed in keeping up with changes. There were some 50 different types of modifications. The aircraft was built in 7 different plants. Still, the Liberator's primary design did not change. The most important part of the Liberator overall was its crew. Typically, the Liberator flew with a pilot and co-pilot. Each aircraft also had a flight engineer, whose responsibility included constant monitoring of the many systems that kept the plane in the air. The radio man kept in contact with other aircraft and base. He would also use the radio to help make navigational fixes. He would act as aircraft photographer when needed, and also was responsible for first aid in the event of injury or wounding. The navigator kept the aircraft in the correct position. This was important, not just to get the bomber to its target, but also to make sure the plane didn't get lost over the vast reaches of water surrounding the tiny islands that were home base. The navigator had particular problems in the Liberator because of the limited visibility forward. The nose gun turret obscured vision. The bombardier was, in many ways, the most important man aboard the aircraft. It was his job to get the Liberator bombs to hit the assigned target. In the final moments of the bomb run, he would have absolute control over the aircraft. The gunner's job required many hours of just riding along until facing a few seconds of hell when enemy planes were sighted. It was freezing at high altitude, and the waist gunners particularly were exposed to the raw, thin air of the jet stream. Frostbite caused more injuries by far than did enemy fire. The Zeros that the men faced in the Pacific were very maneuverable. Their weakness was lack of speed and not having a high ceiling. Still, the Zero could be deadly to a heavily loaded bomber lumbering along full of fuel and bombs. In the European theater of operations, the B-24 joined the B-17 as the heavy bombers of the American Army Air Force. Crews would rise early on the day of their mission to prepare for the long and dangerous flights. American air strategy was based on precision daylight bombing. The British had abandoned daylight strategic bombing early in the war as being too dangerous, but the Americans felt their heavily armed planes could punch through Axis defenses. Day after day, from bases in North Africa, England, and later Italy, the liberators would struggle into the air with their heavy loads. The Americans took heavy casualties until long-range fighter escorts were able to defend the bombers throughout the entire mission. Right up until the end of the war, the German Luftwaffe was able to get fighters into the air. Even with American fighter escorts, these veterans of the Battle of Britain and Russia took to the air to defend the fatherland. While flying in increasing few numbers as the war progressed, the individual skills of the German fighter pilots was great. They would cause misery to the bombers. Brave men on both sides would die in the skies above Europe. Still, the sheer number of bombers in the Allied air fleets tipped the odds in favor of the Allies. This did not help the individual planes that did get hit and struggled to get back to base. To be wounded over Germany meant long, painful hours before getting proper medical attention. Many didn't survive the ordeal. For those that did, the chances of surviving injury increased dramatically once they were back on the ground. The immense 8,000-pound bomb load capacity of the Liberator made it perfect in the later stages of the war for dropping supplies accurately to troops on the ground. Many soldiers' lives were saved with these cargo missions. German industrial production was the target of many Allied bombers. To strategists, from Winston Churchill on down, none was more important than Germany's oil supplies. Fully one-third of Hitler's petroleum needs were met by production from the Ploiești oil fields in Romania. The oil refineries were too far from England to be hit from there, so a plan was devised to use North African bases to fly across the Mediterranean and strike at Ploiești. planes were prepared for the battle. On August 1st, 2 groups of B-24s of the 9th Air Force joined with 3 groups from the 8th Air Force and flew on the first large-scale raid on the oil fields. It was disaster. The German early warning system had prepared anti-aircraft crews of the impending threat. The planes flew into heavy flak. German fighters raced in among the liberators to strike. 177 liberators flew to Ploiești. More than 100 were either shot down or damaged beyond repair. Ploiești had not been destroyed. The Americans would not be deterred. In April 1944, they would once again raid Ploiești. This time, the oil fields would be destroyed. The price would be high, but the Romanian oil would not be available to the Germans by the time of the Normandy invasion. The men who flew on the missions knew the risks were high. They might be hit by flak, they could freeze to death, be shot to pieces by enemy fighters, or plunge to their deaths in a burning aircraft. Not pleasant thoughts, but this was the world of the B-24 Liberator. Those who survived were rightly proud of their accomplishments. In July 1939, the American government approved the plans for the B-26 submitted by the Glenn L. Martin Company of Baltimore, Maryland, and production began. The plane originally had the designation Model 179. Martin had won the Army Air Corps' order for a medium bomber, although the aircraft would not fly until November 1940. War was imminent, and American industrial might was roaring to life after the long, lean years of the Depression. Metal alloys were constantly being improved to increase bomber strength. The American technological might of the era, in addition to having plentiful raw resources, meant that all-metal aircraft could pour out of American factories. While the British, struggling to survive the blockade of U-boats in the North Atlantic, had to make do with fabric-covered bombers with wooden frames. The workload was intense. During this time, with full production of bombers underway, the Martin Company's Baltimore plant had become the largest aircraft factory in the United States. The workforce had grown from 3,000 to 13,000. 3 shifts worked around the clock. The Army's requirements for the new bomber were a bomb payload of 3,000 pounds, a flying range of 2,000 miles, and a top speed of over 300 miles per hour. No limit was given to landing or takeoff speed. The production models would far exceed these mandates. The very design of the B-26 made it a very special plane, one that factory workers would have to take great care in building. The urgencies of war meant there would be no prototype built. The first production planes were meant for operations. For the men and women on the home front, the manufacture of the B-26 would be a challenge. It would be one that they would meet. To attain a high speed, the wings were placed high in the fuselage. Its aluminum alloy fuselage was built in 3 parts. The bomb bays were made an integral part of the wing section. Every aspect of the bomber was designed for sleekness and speed. Early models of the bomber had a wingspan of 63 feet and had a very high wing loading factor of 51 pounds per square inch. The tail fins were of smooth, stress-skin cantilever structure. The rudder was fabric, but the elevators were covered with metal skin. The fuselage was designed to have 2 bomb bays, fore and aft. 2 2,000-pound bombs were capable of being carried in the front, while nearly 5,000 pounds of small bombs could be carried in the rear. There was enough room in the tail section for the rear gunner to be able to sit upright. Each section of the plane had to be carefully fitted together in order to maintain structural integrity. The B-26 was expected to endure high stress during flight. Its engine nacelles were streamlined. Its very look earned it the nickname the Flying Torpedo. The engines were two 1,920-horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2843 double Wasp radial piston powerhouses. They drove large four-bladed propellers. More than 5,100 B-26s would be built for the Army Air Force before production ended at the conclusion of the war. A number of these saw service with the RAF in Britain and the Royal South African Air Force. Variants of the Marauder were designed to carry a 2,000-pound torpedo and two 1,600-pound bombs. The first deliveries of the bomber to the Air Force resulted in near cancellation of the entire project. As the B-26 went from the production lines to active training units, there was little time to train the instructors to train the pilots. The Air Force established several training fields, including one at MacDill Field in Tampa, Florida. The unique design, combined with the higher takeoff and landing speeds, it would land at 130 miles per hour, made for many initial accidents. There was nothing inherently wrong with the design. Pilots just didn't have the right training to deal with problems, such as stalls at slow speeds. Soon the many accidents led the B-26 to earn such nicknames as the Flying Prostitute, the Widowmaker, the Wingless Wonder, and the Baltimore Whore, because the wings were so small it had no visible means of support. The slogan at MacDill became "One a day into Tampa Bay" because so many planes were crashing. It was not a good beginning for the B-26. Early in 1942, a Senate committee, led by Harry Truman, led an investigation into the B-26. The senators recommended production of the Marauder be stopped. But the few pilots who had mastered the aircraft insisted that it was fundamentally sound. Still, the Marauders kept crashing. Civilian ferry pilots sometimes refused to fly a B-26. Ultimately, General Jimmy Doolittle, the hero of the B-25 Mitchell raid on Tokyo, was assigned to personally investigate the B-26. Every aspect of the program was examined. Ultimately, it was determined that inexperienced air crews and ground crews were not getting adequate training. Doolittle sent his technical advisor on a tour of training bases to demonstrate the proper handling of the aircraft. Eventually, the B-26 would become one of the safest planes to fly in the Air Force, with one of its lowest accident rates. Overcoming the jinxed reputation of the B-26 would not be easy. Hollywood was enlisted to help convince pilots and crews that the B-26 could be a very safe airplane, but only if treated with respect. A film was produced to point out the problems of the aircraft and how to deal with them without panicking. In these scenarios, a veteran B-26 pilot takes a new pilot on a test flight. The veteran points out the various unique features of the plane. The high-speed landing characteristics were highlighted for special study. The actor portraying the veteran describes the problems. The pilots were told the B-26 had severe problems when one engine went dead. The film depicts what happens when an engine dies due to gasoline being inadvertently dumped overboard. Recovery is quick and professional. Overcoming this problem was crucial to the B-26 program's survival.
Transfer gas to the main tanks. I'm going on instruments for a minute, and I want you to keep your eye on that B-26 from my side while I'm flying blind.
Yes, sir.
Hand me the blind flying hood. Watch that 26 from your side, Jim. I'm going to let down to 4,000 feet to show you how easy it is to set a constant rate of descent in a B-26. Nose down slightly and trim. Check airspeed. What's the fuel pressure? 0. Flip on the booster. No rise in pressure. The field's inside. Do you think we can make it? I think so. I'm going to feather that dead engine. Watch me. Ignition switch is left on until the propeller has stopped turning. I center my ball and needle and slow up to 155, increasing my trim as I do. Isn't that a lot of trim, Dick? You need it because of the natural torque of the operating engine. Going on the right engine requires about 5 degrees more trim than if you were going on the left. The slower I go, the more trim I need. But I've got to watch that needle and ball while trimming. What's the airspeed? 155. Between 150 and 160 is correct. But 155 is plenty fast for single-engine operation. Shall I give him the bad news back at the tower? Tower from 7645. I'm about 8 miles west of field. 4,000 feet, operating on a single engine. Request instructions for emergency landing. Go ahead.
7645 from the tower. The field is clear for emergency landing. Wind is south 10. Go ahead.
7645, roger. little short of altitude, are we? I guess I'd better hit the emergency salvo release. I didn't expect to have to demonstrate these emergency procedures so soon. Landing gear down and check your instruments.
Efforts such as this dramatization saved countless lives and helped make the B-26 crews ready for deployment in Europe, where they were sorely needed.
Very interesting, Captain.
In early 1943, B-26 squadrons were sent to England, where they formed the basis of the medium bomber forces of the 8th Air Force. They proved most effective at medium-altitude pinpoint bombing. In preparation for the D-Day landings, they targeted bridges, airfields, railroad yards, gun positions, ammunition dumps, oil facilities, and later V-1 flying bomb launchers. They became part of the wide effort to soften up German positions. In the days immediately prior to the invasion, they hit German facilities at the beachheads. The Air Force had done all it could. It was now time for the men of the invasion forces to hit the beaches. The success of the B-26 in both strategic and accurate tactical bombing paved the way for planners to create new aircraft as the Second World War drew to a close. The follow-on medium bomber to the B-26 Marauder was the A-26 Invader built by Douglas Aircraft. After the Marauder was withdrawn from service in 1948, the A-26 was redesignated the B-26. Ever since, there has been confusion over the two aircraft. The new B-26 served in the Korean War very effectively as a tactical bomber. It survived in the Air Force inventory through the Vietnam War, where its ruggedness and armaments capacity was perfect for anti-insurgency. It was a suitable legacy for the B-26 name. The B-25 was one of the most popular Allied bombers in World War II. Originally designated the NA-40, the prototype built by North American Aviation first flew in January 1939. It was designed as a medium bomber, but would evolve into much more. A gunship and low-altitude tactical attack bomber. It was rugged and powerful. It was also heavily armed. Its tricycle landing gear was an innovation. So popular was the B-25 that it was the only American aircraft type flown by the Army, Air Force, the Navy, and the Marine Corps. The B-25 was also a popular export, flown by the RAF and other Allied air forces. Nearly 10,000 were ultimately built during the war. Variants continued flying operationally well into the 1970s. The Mitchell was appropriately named after U.S. General Billy Mitchell, an outspoken early advocate of aerial bombing. Mitchell had incurred the wrath of his superiors demonstrating the effectiveness of air power after World War I. It would not be until the 1930s that his vision was recognized. The American Army Air Corps was quickly built up as the Second World War approached. Young officers eagerly joined up, but they needed modern machines to fly. The Mitchell was popular from the start. It needed relatively few revisions after initial testing. As a medium bomber, it originally was configured with 3 30-caliber machine guns forward with a single 50 caliber in the tail. It was designed to carry 5 men and up to 3,000 pounds of bombs. Its flight ceiling was nearly 24,000 feet, but usually attacked from lower altitudes. Its operational maximum speed was 240 miles per hour. It was powered by 2 1,700 horsepower Wright R2600 Cyclone 14-cylinder radial engines. Early RAF experience with the Mitchells pointed out the need for heavy armaments, and 50 caliber gun turrets were added. America was still at peace, and these modifications were approached at a leisurely pace. That would soon change. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, changed the world. America had been caught unprepared. These attacks came when there were few Army Air Corps bombers in the Pacific capable of hurting the aggressive Japanese. Many of the planes that were deployed were destroyed in the Japanese raids against Hawaii and the Philippines. The Americans would strike back. The American plan to launch 16 B-25s off the carrier Hornet was unprecedented. Conventional carrier planes didn't have the range or capacity for a large-scale raid. Only the Mitchell was sturdy and powerful enough to take off in less than 500 feet. The crews trained in secret, with only the high command knowing their real destination. Markings were placed on the runways to delineate the length of a carrier flight deck. All extra weight was stripped from the planes. Even some guns would have to go to make room for the extra fuel tanks and the additional weight of gasoline. Tactics were practiced. The bombing run would be low level at about 1,500 feet. The bombers had just enough range to hit Japan and then fly on to land in China. Doolittle planned to launch once the Hornet was 450 miles off Japan. But the ship detected a Japanese picket boat when the American fleet was still some 800 miles from Japan. Doolittle made the brave decision to attack, even from this great distance. But it would be a one-way trip for the flyers. After dropping their bombs, they would barely be able to reach the Chinese coast. The weather was miserable. A 40-knot gale blew, but it probably helped the planes get airborne. General Doolittle personally led in the first plane. Just after noon on April 18, 1942, American bombs rained down on the Japanese capital. The enemy was caught off guard. Anti-aircraft fire was ineffective. The greatest enemy was the shortage of fuel. Most of the planes made it to China, but just barely. 49 out of 50 men parachuted to safety. 2 planes crash-landed by Allied lines, but 2 planes ended up in Japanese territory, and some crew members were executed by the Japanese. 1 plane made it to the Soviet Far East, where aircraft and crew were interred by the then neutral Russians. Relatively little damage was done during the raid, but the psychological impact was great. Up to this point, the Japanese had seemed unstoppable. Now the war would take a different direction. American morale soared, but the Japanese were angry. They would send their fleet to Midway to destroy the Americans in one final great sea battle. But it would be the Japanese fleet that was devastated. The Japanese aggression in the Pacific had finally been halted. The war was far from being won, but the Americans had shown with their B-25s that they had both the courage and the technology to bring the war to the Japanese homeland. General Hap Arnold, head of the newly designated Army Air Force, adopted the Mitchell as his personal staff plane early in the war. The very attributes that made it a favorite with pilots, speed, maneuverability, and ease of handling, made it a perfect staff plane. Still, the B-25 was a warbird, and tests continued on fine-tuning its design. After the first prototype had flown and required modifications made, the B-25 went into full production. The first B-25 design flew in 1940, and production models were delivered to operational squadrons in 1941. Improvements and refinements were an ongoing part of its manufacture. Pilot armor was introduced, along with self-sealing fuel tanks. The North American Aviation Plant in Inglewood, California, was a prime manufacturing point for the B-25. North American designed the plane to be built with 48 major assemblies. This made modifications easier. It proved to be a major advantage of the B-25. The A, B, then C series were soon pouring off the assembly lines. Later models of the plane were also built in Kansas City, Kansas. Every revision was a potential major improvement. The lower gun turret, for instance, was dropped. New ways of positioning guns were devised. Again, because of the North American aviation approach to construction, making individual assembly units, these improvements could be ready-made. In the B-25 H and J models, countersunk rivets were used to reduce drag on the forward third of the fuselage, with brazier heated rivets used in the rest of the plane. This pushed up both the speed and the ceiling of the Mitchell. The gun design included both manual and mechanically controlled fire. The B-25 became part of the home front offensive in America. Aside from the drama of the Doolittle raid, the B-25 was, in the beginning, simply a medium bomber. In the Middle East, it acted out this classic role. It served alongside heavy bombers such as the B-17 and B-24 in strategic, precision, high-altitude raids. As such, it was more vulnerable to German anti-aircraft guns. Mitchell supported the British Eighth Army's great offensive at El Alamein. They struck at German troop concentrations, gun positions, and vehicles. The struggle in the Middle East proved to be a painful introduction to war for many American aircrews. North American aviation engineering proved itself in the field. Support crews were easily able to cannibalize parts from damaged aircraft to piece together new aircraft. More than one B-25 flew that had begun life as 2 or even 3 airplanes. In many ways, the B-25's greatest success came in the Pacific theater of operations. It was from Australian bases that ground crews began experimenting with the armaments aboard the bomber. The missions over the Pacific were somewhat different than those in the Middle East. Here, Japanese shipping was a main target. Also, the terrain was often dense jungle. The bombers were needed for close air support of ground troops or tactical interdiction missions against small and sometimes mobile Japanese targets. At the midpoint of the war, the threat by enemy aircraft was less than in the European theater. Instead of a bombardier sitting in the nose of the plane, 50 caliber machine guns were installed. This later became a factory standard for some models of the bomber. It really became an attack aircraft. If the forward turret were fixed in the forward position, then 14 50 caliber guns could be brought to bear on a target. Eventually, even a 75 millimeter cannon was installed. One later model B-25 managed to sink a Japanese destroyer after firing just 7 shells from this fearsome armament. Further modifications included a maritime version that carried a torpedo. Both the size and weight of the torpedo meant that only one could be carried and not completely inside the bomb bay. Since the Mitchell was not pressurized, the open bomb bay did not hinder its flying, but it would have taken a toll on the crew being directly exposed to the sub-zero temperatures of high altitude. This modification did not catch on as an efficient use of the Mitchell, and a more conventional approach to anti-ship armament, such as rockets and regular bombs, were adopted. Through various adaptations, the bomber gradually was able to increase its bomb load from 6 to 8 250-pound bombs. Changes also allowed for 6 325-pound bombs to be carried. External bomb racks were added so that 8 250-pound bombs could be carried externally. All of this provided great flexibility in planning missions for the B-25. In the Pacific theater, change was often quick, and the B-25 was a very useful resource. But it was its guns that ultimately proved to be the bomber's greatest asset in the Pacific. For the Marines on the ground, a B-25 loaded with thousands of rounds of 50 caliber machine gun bullets to blast away at entrenched Japanese positions was very welcome. Guns were placed in the nose, alongside the fuselage, and on the forward turret. By late 1943, large B-25 missions were underway in the Pacific. On one raid, 70 Mitchells and B-24 bombers dropped more than 200 tons of bombs. The Mitchell had now been adopted by the Royal New Zealand and Australian Air Forces and the Chinese Air Force. They would be used against strategic targets as well as in strafing runs. Its role as an anti-ship weapon increased. At one point, they were even used against Japanese tanks. In Burma, Mitchell specialized in attacking and destroying bridges. All through the Pacific, thousands of B-25s were deployed, serving from the mountains of Southeast Asia to small islands. At times, the Mitchells were pressed into service as transports, carrying ammunition. They were fast and well able to defend themselves. They could fly out of airfields shorter than those needed by the larger B-17s, B-24s, and the new B-29s. Flying at low levels to attack the Japanese had its risks. Small arms fire could be directed at them, and their own bombs going off could potentially knock them from the sky. Parachute bombs were employed. This would allow the Mitchell to fly at very low altitude and have enough time to escape before the bombs exploded. Another innovation was the bouncing bomb, which would literally hit the ground, bounce back up into the sky before falling back down and then exploding. It was an unorthodox tactic, but it worked. It was another example of wartime ingenuity. Working closely with the ground forces meant the Mitchells could literally open up pathways for the Marines to advance. Many Japanese airfields were destroyed by air, thus saving countless Allied lives. As the Japanese troops withdrew, the Mitchells could jump ahead of the Marines to soften up targets. This successful close cooperation between ground and air units would lead to aircraft being designed specifically for close air support. While production of the B-25 wound down at the end of the war, its usefulness certainly did not. Unlike many of its sister bombers, such as the B-17 and B-24, the Mitchell continued in service. Some 1,000 Mitchells were upgraded and modified in the 1950s. This included improved engine systems and overall engineering improvements. The American Air Force used the Mitchell as training and staff transport. The last B-25 was retired in 1960. Mitchells were also used by Canada after the war. The Netherlands East Indies Air Force used them against insurgents in the late 1940s, and various Central and South American countries received the planes. The Mitchell, rushed into wartime service, proved a durable aircraft. General Billy Mitchell would have been proud. The B-29 was given its first operational mission in the summer of 1943 at a military conference in Quebec, Canada. General Hap Arnold, commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces, submitted a plan to use the new bomber to raid Japan from bases in China. It was a bold move since the B-29 was just coming off the production lines, and many problems such as overheating engines had not been fully worked out. Still, the plan was approved. The B-29 was going to war. The initial idea for building the B-29 began in the late 1930s when the concept for a very long-range bomber designed for the defense of the Western Hemisphere emerged. The United States still wanted to stay out of any European war, and the thought was a plane based in the U.S. could reach any potential enemy if it had a range of around 5,000 miles. In September 1940, the War Department authorized prototype planes to be built, 3 by the Boeing Company and 3 by Consolidated Aviation. The Boeing design, the XB-29, was superior to the Consolidated XB-32. Only a handful of the B-32 Dominators would ever reach service. Nearly 4,000 B-29s would be built. Still, in 1940, the success of the Superfortress was far from assured. The specifications for the bomber were extraordinary for its time. It could carry 11 men in pressurized comfort, up to 32,000 feet in altitude. Its operational range would be more than 4,000 miles. The tail of the plane rose nearly 27 feet. It had a wingspan of 141 feet and was nearly 100 feet long. It was designed to carry some 20,000 pounds of bombs at 350 miles per hour. The B-17 could only carry a 5,000-pound bomb load and flew much slower. The 4 turrets on the aircraft carried 2 50-caliber machine guns each. The tail gun position could be equipped with 3 50-caliber guns or a 20-millimeter cannon and 2 50-caliber guns. Control of all but the tail guns was through an early model computer, operated through a central command position. The gunners could aim by remote control. Putting the thousands of pieces together was a monumental job, and it didn't go smoothly. This was new territory in aircraft design and manufacture. By 1942, the project had earned the nickname the $3 billion gamble. The price in today's dollars would be many billions more. There was no certainty the plane would really work. In September 1942, the first prototype flew. Soon thereafter, another prototype crashed. General Arnold was getting unhappy. The planes were needed. The pressure was on to deliver. By summer 1943, production models of the B-29 were flying, but neither the aircraft nor its crews were ready for combat. Much testing and training remained, but the Air Force was facing a deadline. President Roosevelt had promised his Chinese allies that the B-29s would be in China to bomb the Japanese by January of 1944. The Chinese were getting ready for the arrival of their American allies. They desperately wanted to be able to strike at Japan. 200,000 Chinese laborers worked diligently to prepare the airfields, but they would use a process that was literally a world away from the technology at work in the Boeing factories producing the B-29s. The Chinese were building runways for the B-29 by hand. They had no concrete, so 4 runways, each of them 8,500 feet long, were made by hand-crushing stone. Wheelbarrow by wheelbarrow, loads of crushed stone was spread out. Slowly but inevitably, the runways were getting constructed. The Chinese worked for 9 American cents a day in pay. Giant 10-ton stone rollers were pulled along by hundreds of workers to compact the stone. Some workers were crushed to death in the process. Still, the airstrips were ready for the B-29s as they flew over the Himalayas from base camps in India. Though much work and preparation remained, the B-29s would be ready for their first raid. General Arnold ordered the initial attack to take place in June 1944. The target would be Japanese steelworks on the southern Japanese island of Kyushu. The Imperial Iron and Steel Works at Yawata produced 25% of Japan's entire rolled steel supplies. This enabled the Japanese industrial infrastructure to keep in full swing. The Japanese merchant fleet was still one of the largest in the world. As ships continued being launched, immune from Allied attack, they would be able to resupply Japanese islands under attack. This kind of strategic target was perfect for the giant bomb load of the B-29. Moreover, a B-29 attack would prove a great psychological boost for the Chinese, millions of whom were still under savage Japanese occupation. China did not have to suffer too much longer. Preparations for the first raid were underway. Virtually everything, from bombs to fuel, had to be brought in across the hump from India. This journey was dangerous on its own without the ongoing threat of Japanese fighters. Ground crews worked around the clock to get the bombers ready. A problem with overheating engines on the B-29 had still not been totally licked. Flight engineers would have to keep a close eye on all the giant craft systems. The attack would be at the relatively low level of between 8,000 and 18,000 feet and would be at night. What might be sacrificed in accuracy would be made up for by lowering expected casualties. Fuel was scarce. There was only enough gas for 75 planes to make the 3,200-mile round trip. Takeoffs commenced. One bomber crashed immediately, and another 6 had to abort the mission soon after getting in the air. 64 B-29s were left to head to Kyushu. The long ride would be tense for the many green airmen for whom this would be their first real taste of combat. Navigation in the night skies was difficult. Only 47 planes found their targets. At just before midnight, the bombardiers readied themselves for the final approach to the steelworks below. Flak exploded in the midst of the bomber group. Still, the planes stayed on what they hoped was the right course. Finally, it was bombs away. Three planes were so damaged by flak, they crashed, killing all aboard. Another B-29 landed at an emergency Chinese field, but was attacked and destroyed by Japanese fighters. The results of the first B-29 mission were not good. Little real damage was done. Some bombardiers had missed their mark by 20 miles. Still, Japan had been attacked from ground bases. The B-29s would return, again and again. There were too many logistical nightmares at the Chinese airfields for even the Americans to overcome. Tokyo was still out of range. The B-29 would not come into its own as a credible strategic weapon until the Mariana Islands in the Western Pacific were captured by hard-fighting Marines. The islands of Guam, Saipan, and Tinian were only 1,300 miles southeast of Tokyo and were perfect for bomber bases. They were easily supplied by ship. Now, large-scale raids could finally be mounted. Still, it would take months of preparation before the airfields would be rebuilt and made ready for the heavy B-29s. Five airfields were prepared by hard-working CB engineers. Plane after plane arrived on the islands. The 21st Bomber Command would be responsible for the raids. General Arnold appointed one of his top men, Brigadier General Haywood Hansell Jr., to carry this new air offensive to Japan. The general's arrival set the tone for the upcoming campaign.
Well, the first element of the 21st Bomber Command has arrived. When we've done some more fighting, we'll do some more talking. Thank you.
The ground crews worked hard to make the bases ready for assault on Japan. The 15-hour round trip to Tokyo meant that little could be left to chance. There were no emergency fields in the vast Pacific for a wounded B-29. General Curtis LeMay, the tough, cigar-chomping Patton of the air, took command of the 21st Bomber Command. LeMay's goal was nothing less than the destruction of Japan from the air. The B-29s went out in increasingly large numbers. LeMay had some guns removed, so the bombers were lighter and could carry a greater bomb load further. The constant flying took its toll on the volatile engines. There was nearly a 25% engine failure rate. Maintenance procedures were improved. The capture of Iwo Jima brought the B-29 fleet to Japanese home waters. The bombers would have fighter escorts, and the island would serve as an emergency landing strip, saving hundreds of lives. While the logistical problems of B-29 basing had finally been overcome, the hazards of flying in the huge bomber were always present. The B-29 weighed some 65 tons. It had four 2,200 horsepower Wright R-3350-57 Cyclone turbocharged radial piston engines that could barely handle the load. It took 40 seconds for the plane to get airborne, and it needed every inch of an 8,500-foot runway. Sometimes not even this was enough. The long missions meant the crews could be up for 24 hours at a stretch. Falling asleep was a very real danger. They might be in danger over Japan for just a few minutes of the 15-hour mission. Most of the time, they just droned to and from the target. The navigator was key to a mission's success. He would have to use dead reckoning, the occasional star sighting, and radar to figure out where the plane was heading. Until Iwo Jima was taken, any mistake could mean the bomber would not make it back to base. They didn't carry enough fuel to allow much margin for safety. Once the bombers were in Japanese airspace, everyone became very alert. The threat of Japanese fighters, especially in the early days of the campaign, was very real. Zeros were very effective fighters. The Japanese were flying at their ceiling limits, but still they could get close to the bombers. The B-29s faced an even greater threat as the Japanese grew more desperate. Pilots would adopt suicide tactics. If they could not shoot down a B-29, they would simply try to ram one and bring both aircraft down in a ball of flames. The battle in the skies over Japan was a very personal war between the B-29 air crews and the Japanese defenders. General LeMay changed bombing tactics in March of 1945. He ordered widespread incendiary bomb attacks on Japanese cities. The pretense of attacking strategic military targets was gone. LeMay took war to its logical conclusion: utter destruction of the enemy with the most efficient means available. It was, ironically, a humane way to wage warfare, if it resulted in a quicker end to the madness. 334 B-29s went on the first firebomb run. 16 square miles of Tokyo was destroyed. Ultimately, more Japanese would die in the incendiary attacks than from the atomic bombs that would soon fall on Japan. The devastation was total. In spite of the incredible damage done to the Japanese people and the horror they were experiencing, the Japanese High Command refused to give in. President Truman gave the go-ahead for B-29s to drop the atomic bomb, first on Hiroshima and then Nagasaki. Japan finally surrendered. The war was over. Thousands of airmen had died in the war against Japan. The B-29, in spite of its early problems, had become the backbone of the American assault on the home islands. The B-29 would still serve in the new U.S. Air Force during the Korean War. It proved itself a capable conventional bomber. But soon it was surpassed by the new jet bombers. A number of B-29s were transferred to the British Royal Air Force, where they served a nuclear deterrent role with the designation Washington. The Russians copied a captured B-29 and developed the Tu-4 nuclear bomber. The last B-29 would retire from the U.S. Air Force on June 21, 1960. The Superfortress could finally stand down after a job well done.